This happened last year. I was 22 at the time, completely burnt out from work, and I was going through one of those stretches where everything in life felt like it was happening to someone else. I won't get into specifics, but let's just say I had a colorful past. And by that point, I was actively trying to put some distance between myself and certain chapters of my life. What I needed more than anything was to disappear for a few days. We've all been there. I must have been venting out loud because one day at work, I found myself having a conversation with a coworker about this tiny island off the coast of Maine. The way he described it, the place sounded almost aggressively boring. No nightlife, barely any tourists after dark, and most people just took the ferry out for the day and left before sunset. He said if you stayed overnight, it was like having the whole island to yourself, which was exactly what I was looking for. I found a vacation rental listing for a standalone cottage right on the shoreline. The price was suspiciously cheap, and it was available on short notice, which probably should have raised some flags, but I wasn't exactly in a cautious headspace. I booked it without thinking twice. The cottage itself was small, just a single room with a bed, an unused kitchenette, and a bathroom the size of a closet. It was set back from the water, surrounded on three sides by thick brush that pressed right up against the walls. The front faced the ocean with a single window covered by this thin, semi-translucent curtain that didn't do much to block the view in either direction. The walls were paper thin. I could hear the wind moving through the brush like it was right next to my ear. The door had a deadbolt and a chain lock that both looked like they'd been installed recently, which struck me as a little odd for such an isolated spot. But I didn't dwell on it. I took the late afternoon ferry over and spent the early evening just walking around the island. It was kind of surreal watching the place empty out as the day visitors filtered back to the mainland. By the time the sun went down, there was almost no one left. No streetlights, no ambient noise, nothing. I was pretty much left alone to enjoy the sound of the ocean by myself. It was beautiful. I grabbed dinner at this little pub near the ferry landing. The bartender was friendly enough, but I noticed that she gave me a weird face when I told her where I was staying. On the walk back, I passed a small dock tucked into a cave, maybe 100 yards from the cottage. There was a single blue motorboat moored over there. It stood out because all the other boats I'd seen on the island were larger lobster vessels. I made a mental note of it, but didn't think too much beyond that. I got back to the cottage around 10:30, locked the deadbolt in the chain, and settled in for the night. Up until that point, I was really enjoying the time away from everything. But of course, that piece didn't last. I realized my phone charger was busted. Or maybe it was the outlet I was using. But the point is, my phone wouldn't charge no matter what I tried. I tried every outlet in the cottage. My phone was on low battery, and I was 100% sure it was going to die within the hour. Luckily, I didn't really need it to get back to the ferry. I had a physical ticket, but no one likes having a dead phone. I decided to just call it a night and go to sleep. I was exhausted anyway, and I did fall asleep pretty quickly, actually. The exhaustion from the past few nights hit me all at once, and I was out within a few minutes of my head hitting the pillow. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. I don't know what pulled me out of my sleep exactly, but once I was awake, I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside the cottage. They were close, right in front of the door, and whoever was out there was taking their time, which I could tell because there was a long pause in between each step. It definitely didn't sound like an animal scurrying around. I shifted in bed just slightly, and the footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was uncomfortable in a way that I couldn't really describe. It stretched on long enough that I started to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, or that it really had just been an animal. I didn't want to move, so I just stared at the ceiling in that same position. I'm not sure what I was waiting for, but I was so freaked out that I couldn't even think straight. And a few minutes later, the footsteps came back. This time, there was no mistaking the direction. They weren't passing by. They were approaching. I heard them come right up to the entrance of the cottage and stop directly in front of the door. At that point, my heart was damn near pounding out of my chest. I felt like they could hear it, but there was nothing I could do besides try and be as silent as possible. As if the situation wasn't bad enough, whoever was out there turned on a flashlight and tried shining it through the front door. I couldn't move because I was petrified in fear. That person clicked off the light, and tried the door handle. I shut my eyes and prayed the deadbolts would hold, and it did. I thought that would be enough of a deterrent, but I was wrong. A few seconds passed, and then they tried again, putting more weight into it this time. Then came several hard bangs, one after another. The sound was so loud in that tiny little cottage that I actually flinched with each impact. The bangs activated my brain, though the threat was more real. And even though I was still terrified, I knew I had to do something. So, without thinking, I jumped out of bed while that person was still banging on the door and crouched down behind it. I was fully prepared for what was about to happen. But instead of that person bursting through the door, everything went quiet. I stayed crouched down for a few seconds, trying not to breathe too loudly. And I still remember this vividly, whoever was on the other side of the door spoke. "I know you're in there, Leo." I almost yelled out in shock, but I stopped myself. It was a man's voice, one I didn't recognize, but he somehow knew my name. He knew I was there. The footsteps moved away from the door and along the side of the cottage. I tracked the sound as it passed the bathroom wall and continued around. He was taunting me. He knew I was in there. My confidence was gone. Hearing my own name was enough to make me dizzy. It was the scariest moment of my entire life. Over the next stretch of time, I have no idea how long, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, whoever was outside circled the cottage. I had no idea what they were doing, and a part of me was screaming for them to just break down the door and get it over with already. Eventually, the footsteps receded from the cottage. Then, from the direction of the dock, I heard an engine start. It was the unmistakable sound of a small outboard motor. I listened as it pulled away from the shore and faded into the distance across open water. I didn't sleep after that. That's not an exaggeration. I stayed awake the entire night. The second it was bright enough to see, I was out the door. The gravel around the cottage told the whole story. There were heavy boot prints circling the cottage multiple times. The prints led in a straight line from the cottage toward the dock and ended right at the water line. The next day was honestly a blur. I returned the key to the property owner, boarded a ferry, and made it home. But I was not in a good headspace. Here's the thing that still gets me. Whoever was outside, that cottage didn't come from the island. They came by boat, specifically to that cottage. And on that specific night, they knew my name and exactly where I'd be. The thing is, I have absolutely no idea how they could have tracked me down. I confronted my co-worker about it a few days later, the one who told me about that island in the first place. And he swore up and down he hadn't told anyone about my trip. And honestly, I believed him. He looked genuinely freaked out when I told him what happened. I mentioned earlier that I have a colorful past. I'm not going to get into the details, but let's just say I'm not exactly shocked that someone out there might want to find me. What I still can't wrap my head around is how did someone track me to some random island off the coast of Maine? How did they know which rental I booked and on which night? How long had they been watching me before any of this? I don't have any answers to any of those questions. And the worst part is I still work the same job and live in the same place. Nothing has changed since then, but I have no reason to believe things are over. This happened many, many years ago. I'm a structural engineer, and at the time I was finishing up my graduate thesis on concrete degradation in marine environments. It was very boring, but it's what got me invited to Japan. This is all relevant, by the way. I was in Nagasaki for an academic conference. There was this professor I'd been corresponding with who had done extensive research on post-industrial decay. His name was Dr. Yamamoto, and he pulled some strings and arranged something I never thought I'd get access to, a research permit for Hashima Island. If you don't know Hashima, you've probably seen pictures of it without realizing. It's this tiny island off the coast of Nagasaki that looks like a battleship, completely covered in crumbling concrete apartment blocks. It used to be a coal mining operation, one of the most densely populated places on Earth at its peak. They abandoned it in the 70s when the coal ran out, and it's been rotting ever since. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. Tourists can technically visit, but only on guided tours that stick to a narrow concrete path along the seawall. Civilians are expressly forbidden from entering the actual buildings due to structural integrity concerns. But I wasn't subject to the same restrictions, of course, which was thrilling and a little scary. I had to sign an exhaustive stack of papers. basically waiving my right to damages should I injure myself or something. The morning of the visit, I took an early ferry from Nagasaki. It wasn't a tourist boat, but rather a smaller vessel arranged through the research office. It was just me and my escort, a guy named T-Shirt. He didn't talk much. I didn't really mind because I was so hyped about the excursion. The approach to Hashima plays tricks on your eyes. When it first appears within your line of sight, it looks deceptively small, insignificant almost. But then as you get closer, the scale of it hits you. The seawall wrapping around the entire island, the apartment blocks stacked on top of each other. It really is something else. I had seen hundreds of photos, but none of them prepared me for actually laying my eyes on what I can only describe as a true wonder. T-Shirt gave me the briefing on the dock. I had access to several buildings beyond the normal tour route. He actually had a list, but there were still rules such as stay on designated paths. Don't enter anything marked with red tape. Don't remove anything. Don't touch anything you don't need to, and stay within visual range of him at all times. He said that last part twice. I also had to wear a hard hat, steel-toed boots, and these bulky reinforced work pants that made it a little difficult to walk. Despite all the excess gear, the first couple hours were amazing. I was taking photos, taking notes, completely in my element. T-Shirt followed at a distance, occasionally glancing at his watch. He clearly wanted this over with. We entered one of the large residential blocks around midday. The stairs were intact, but barely. You could see daylight through the gaps in the landing. Teasy waited on the ground floor while I went up, which I thought was a little strange given his whole stay within visual range speech. But I wasn't going to argue. It was kind of irritating having him follow me around. Anyway, I was on the fourth floor examining a section of wall where the concrete had completely separated from the rebar underneath when I noticed something off. The dust patterns were wrong. There was dust everywhere. Obviously, decades of it. But there was this path through it, like someone had been walking this route regularly. Not recently, maybe, but often enough that the dust hadn't fully settled back. I followed it with my eye and realized it led to a room at the end of the corridor. I should have gone back down to tell T-Shirt, which would have been the smart thing. But I was curious and wanted to check things out for myself. He probably would have just ushered me back downstairs anyway, depriving me of ever getting an answer. So I carefully walked over to the room and pushed the door open. I immediately noticed two things, both of which were incredibly unsettling. Firstly, there was this weird smell emanating from the room that I didn't recognize. It didn't really smell like anything natural, but I couldn't recognize it as any kind of human smell either. I know that makes no sense, but that specific smell was genuinely something I have never encountered before. The second thing was even more confusing. The wall I touched was hot, or at least noticeably warmer, than any of the other surfaces I'd felt on the island. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds trying to process it. You might be thinking the warmth was probably due to sun exposure. And yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's what I was thinking, too, even though there weren't any gaps in the ceiling. And I figured the smell could have been animals, even though I wasn't aware that any animals even lived on Hashima. I went back down and mentioned it to T-Shirt. His reaction was immediate and strange. He didn't ask me any clarifying questions or even seem that concerned. He just told me that what I saw was impossible and that no humans or animals lived on the island. He didn't even ask me to take him to that room. When I insisted that he follow me so I could show him the smell for himself, he flatly refused. His reaction was really disturbing, to be quite honest. We continued the tour, and I started being much more observant every time he allowed me to enter a building. I kept noticing weird things. Nothing fully revealing like clothes or anything like that, but weird markings and signs that something had been there. I say something because I didn't know whether I was seeing signs of a person or signs of an animal, which was the most confusing part. At one point, I mentioned more of these sightings to Keishi, and this time he didn't even respond. Instead, he just pulled out his radio and spoke rapid Japanese into it. I had no idea what he was saying or who he was even talking to, but it was the first time he had used the radio since we got off the boat. When I asked him what he said, he told me he was checking the schedule. I obviously didn't believe him, but what was I supposed to do? Demand that he tell me what he said? I just ignored him, but I was significantly more unsettled after that. It was almost like he knew what was going on and just didn't want to tell me. We reached a taller residential block near the center of the island. T-shirt hesitated at the entrance. He actually stopped walking and stood there for a few seconds before following me in. I remember thinking that was weird. He'd been bored and impatient all morning, and now he was all attentive. But I didn't care. I wasn't going to let someone else's attitude stop me from exploring. The stairwell was narrow and dark, but structurally sound. We went up maybe 5 floors. T-shirt was right behind me the whole time, which felt like a change from his earlier indifference. And then, after walking into one of the corner rooms up there, I saw something that immediately validated all my previous concerns. Against one of the walls was a pile of blankets and a few empty bottles of water. There was no mistake about it this time. I was looking at definitive evidence of human habitation. I regained my composure after the initial shock and turned to show Takashi. There was no way I was going to allow him to dismiss my claims this time. But when I stepped out of the room, he was gone. I don't know why, but seeing those items in that room didn't terrify me until I realized I was alone up there. It was like T-shirt having disappeared unlocked my brain, and only then was I able to process how scary the situation truly was. There was someone else on that island. I suddenly felt a very acute urge to strip out of my gear and scratch myself. My whole body was itching, and I was starting to freak out. I frantically made my way back to the stairwell we'd come up, thinking I'd just run down and end the trip short. But no, as if things weren't bad enough, I turned the corner and realized the stairs were blocked. There was a pile of rubble spilled across the landing enough that I couldn't get through. I didn't have time to think about whether it had collapsed naturally or whether someone had piled it there purposefully. I just turned and ran. I ran past that room and down the corridor, praying that there was another stairwell somewhere close by. I didn't care about the structural damage anymore. I was so scared and didn't care about anything other than getting the hell out of there. As I was sprinting down the hall, I heard movement from somewhere behind me. It sounded like footsteps stepping out into the hallway. I didn't turn around. No chance in hell. I just kept running. The only problem was that it was like a maze in there. I was too scared to think straight, and I felt like I was running in circles. The whole time I could hear footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was T-shirt, but after a while, I realized there were multiple sets of footsteps, which meant I was being followed by multiple people. I finally found another stairwell, and I practically jumped down it. I don't remember much about getting out of the building. I remember daylight, and then sprinting across open ground, and then the dock. T-shirt was just standing there by the boat. Seeing how unfazed he looked took me from scared to downright angry. I started screaming at him about what I had seen, about the people in that building, about him abandoning me, everything. I think I even accused him of piling that rubble up in an attempt to strand me in there. He barely even blinked. It was like he wasn't hearing what I was saying. I wanted to put my hands on him, but that would have been a terrible idea. He was my way off the island. He had all the power. I had none. The way he didn't even react to what I was saying only made me angrier. At one point, I actually kind of hoped that whoever had been stalking me in that building would turn a corner, so T-shirt would believe me. He waited for me to finally calm down, and then instead of acknowledging anything I had said, he just said we were leaving. I didn't know what to think. I was still pretty unsettled and scared at what had just happened, but I was also horrified that this guy was refusing to acknowledge any of it. It genuinely made me think that he knew something about what had happened. Or worse, maybe he had caused it himself. Maybe he had been the one to pile that rubble. But the worst part was that I had to sit through an entire ferry ride back to the mainland with him. I was genuinely worried for my safety. But we made it back, and that was that. As soon as I got somewhere safe, the first thing I wanted to do was report my sightings. That there were people on Hashima. That was extremely concerning. So I contacted the only person I could think to contact. The only person who had any connection to both me and the island, Dr. Yamamoto. But I couldn't get a hold of him. Fast forward 2 weeks. I was back in the U.S. at that point, and I still couldn't get a hold of him. It was like he had disappeared. I tried my best to report what I had seen to the relevant authorities, but I don't think anything came of it. I don't think anyone believed me. It's been years and years and years since this all happened, but this is a story I'll tell anyone who will listen. Strangely, the thing that both me and gets to me the most isn't what happened on the island, but what happened after. The fact that I couldn't get in contact with Dr. Yamamoto, despite him going to great lengths to arrange my visit to the island. The thing I regret the most is not taking more action to get to the bottom of what was going on there. If I had spoken Japanese, or if I didn't have to return to the U.S. so quickly, I might have been able to do something. This is something I'm going to think about forever. This happened a long time ago. I'm the island, Dr. Yamamoto, but I code-talking 10-plus years. It was during my very last semester of college. I was majoring in history, and I was deep into my senior thesis, which focused on abandoned institutional spaces, places like defunct hospitals, asylums, rehab centers, especially ones that still existed in or around major cities. One of the cases I was writing about was North Brother Island. It was this overgrown island right in the East River, technically part of New York City, but it had been completely abandoned for decades. As far as I know, I wouldn't get a hold of him. Fast forward, still exactly the same, but I haven't been in New York City in forever, so I really wouldn't know. Here's a very abbreviated history. It used to house a quarantine hospital, then a rehab center, and then at some point in the distant past, it became off limits to the public. Unless something's changed, you still need a permit to even set foot there. In fact, it's probably even more heavily guarded considering how seriously the U.S. takes security and whatnot these days. That's all you were 2 weeks. I was back in the USA. Really need to know about it. But for any fellow history buffs out there, feel free to do your own research. You might even find my thesis. I never actually planned on going. That would have been illegal. But I mentioned it offhand one night to two of my friends, Jansen and Jesse, while we were drinking. I was probably pissed at how long it was taking, knowing how lazy and unproductive I was back then. Surprisingly, they both thought my thesis sounded really interesting, despite the fact that neither of them port what I had seen to the relevant authorities, but I don't think anything came of it. I don't think anyone believed me. It's been years and years and years since this all happened, but this is a story I'll tell anyone who will listen. Strangely, the thing that we're history majors. So, I told them some of the interesting tidbits about the various places I was researching. The moment they realized one of the places was quite literally tucked away in the very city we were sitting in, they were hooked. Jansen and Jesse, and I guess myself by extension, were really into that whole urban exploring, edgy vibe back then. Back then, it was decently popular among young guys at the time. They both thought it sounded like the perfect target for an urban exploration trip. And I'll admit, after all the research I had done, I was curious, too. Not in a ghost hunter way or anything, but more like if I was going to describe the place in my thesis, why not actually see it with my own eyes? Fast forward a few weeks, and that's how we found ourselves sneaking through Berto Point Park in the Bronx at 2 a.m. with 3 solo kayaks in tow. It was one of the few spots along the shoreline where you could launch without attracting too much attention, and it was only about a half-mile paddle to the island. We had a bunch of supplies, probably more than we needed, but we figured we'd play it safe. The plan was to leave around 2:30, explore the island for a few hours while it was still dark, and be back before sunrise. It felt stupid and thrilling at the same time. The best kind of fun. Getting our kayaks into the water was surprisingly seamless. I guess I hadn't anticipated how deserted the park was going to be at that time of night. But as soon as we started paddling toward the island, the reality of what we were doing began setting in. There wasn't anything stopping us anymore. All we had to do was paddle at that point, and a bit of nervousness started creeping into what had just moments earlier been pure excitement. Regardless, we made it to the island. Pulling the kayaks onto shore was a bit of a struggle because all the overgrowth. We had to push through some tall reeds and weeds just to find a somewhat stable spot to leave them. Once we were on solid ground, the three of us just kind of stood there for a second, taking it all in. It was dark, obviously, but we had flashlights and the moon was bright enough that you could make out the general shapes of things. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it all was. I know that sounds cliche, but you have to understand, we were technically still in New York City. The Bronx was right there, maybe half a mile away, and yet it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. We started walking inland. It didn't take long for Jansen and Jesse to realize just how big the island actually was. I had told them beforehand that it wasn't some tiny little rock. I think I even showed them a map at some point, but they clearly hadn't internalized it. As we made our way deeper, we started passing building after building. Most of them partially collapsed or so overgrown that you could barely tell they were buildings at all. At one point, Jesse stopped and just stared at this one structure that had a tree, literally splitting it in half. He said it looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic video game, like one of the ones where you're scavenging through the ruins of civilization. He wasn't wrong. That's exactly what it felt like. There was something almost alien about the way nature had reclaimed everything, like the island was actively trying to swallow any evidence that humans had ever been there. I remember thinking that if I didn't know better, I'd assume the place had been empty for centuries, not decades. We explored a few of the more intact buildings, shining our flashlights into rooms that hadn't seen visitors in God knows how long. Most of them were empty, but in one of the larger buildings, Jansen found something on the ground near a doorway, a half-empty can of spray paint. He immediately wanted to use it, and Jesse was on board. I told him no, that it felt disrespectful, not just to the buildings, but to the history of the place. People had lived there, and people had died there, but they pointed out that there was already graffiti all over the walls, some of it pretty elaborate, and argued that a little more wasn't going to make a difference. I didn't have the energy to keep fighting about it, so I told them I wasn't going to stop them, but I wasn't going to stick around and watch either. In hindsight, wandering off was probably a mistake. I made my way through a few more rooms trying to take mental notes for my thesis, but the further I got from Jansen and Jesse, the more unsettling everything became. It's hard to explain unless you've been in a situation like that. When you're with other people, even in a creepy place, there's a buffer. You can tell yourself it's fine because nothing bad would happen with witnesses around or whatever. But being alone is a completely different story. I was walking down a long hallway in one of the larger buildings. I think it might have been part of the old hospital complex when I heard Jesse's voice call my name from somewhere ahead of me from one of the rooms further down the hall. The sound of it made me jump, and even though I knew it was him, I was still pretty freaked out. I started walking toward it, and something began to feel off. For Jesse to be ahead of me, he would have had to take a completely different route through the building. That wasn't impossible. There were multiple hallways and stairways, but would have meant he left Jansen almost immediately after I did, and then speed-walked or even ran just to loop around and end up in front of me. That didn't make any sense. Why would he do that? There were too many rooms branching off in the hallway, and I couldn't tell exactly which one the voice had come from. So I called out to him, asking where he was. I got a response almost immediately from a room just a few doors down on my left. It was definitely Jansen's voice, and all he said was, "In here." I walked toward it. The doorway was dark in the hallway, which was already pretty dark, and I couldn't see anything inside. I figured Jesse and Jansen were probably just messing with me, trying to scare me for wandering off, which is exactly the kind of thing Jansen would think was hilarious. I stepped into the room, without really thinking about it, and swept my flashlight around the room. It landed on a figure standing in the far corner of the room, facing the wall. For a split second, my brain tried to convince me it was one of my friends. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. Whoever this was, they were really tall. Easily 6.5 feet, maybe more. Neither Jansen nor Jesse were anywhere close to that height. I can't express how scary seeing that figure was. I screamed. I couldn't help myself. I ran out of that room as fast as I could. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I was yelling for Jansen and Jesse to run as loudly as I could. I've never been more scared in my life. I felt like whoever had been in that room was going to catch me, or something else would jump out from one of the many pitch-black rooms I was running past. I found my friends near where we'd originally split up. When they saw me sprinting toward them, they just started running, too. We didn't stop until we reached the kayaks. Once we caught our breath, I told them everything. They didn't believe me at first, which I completely understood. If Jansen had told me the same story, I would have assumed he was messing with me. But I pleaded with them to believe me, that I wasn't making it up, and after a minute or so, they actually started to look more scared than me. We decided to just leave. Whatever we'd come to see, it wasn't worth sticking around after that. But right as we started dragging the kayaks back toward the water, all three of us heard it at the same time. It was faint but distinct, a moaning sound coming from somewhere in the darkness behind us. It sounded like a woman, an older woman, either crying or wincing in pain. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough that we could hear it clearly if we focused. None of us said anything, but I could tell Jesse and Jansen were losing it. I was, too. My hands were shaking. We finally got the kayaks into the water. The paddle back felt like it took forever, but we made it. The whole drive, none of us could stop talking about what happened. We went over every detail, trying to make sense of it, try and come up with some rational explanation. But the thing I kept coming back to, the thing that freaked me out the most was the voice. Because that was definitely Jesse's voice I heard in that hallway. I know Jesse's voice as well as I know my own. And whatever called out to me sounded exactly like him, except Jesse was nowhere near that part of the building. He was with Jansen the whole time. I've thought about going back to the island over the years, but I never have. For one thing, I'm pretty sure it's basically impossible now. From what I've read, they've really cracked down on unauthorized access. Even if I wanted to, I don't think I could get within 100 yards of that place without getting intercepted by someone. I really don't believe in the paranormal. I never have, but I have a hard time explaining what happened that night any other way. Someone was on that island with us. Someone who knew my name. Someone who could make their voice sound exactly like Jesse's. I don't think I'll ever get an answer to what happened that night.